All right, so Semi-Slav E6. The name Semi-Slav points at the hybrid character of this variation. With its distinctive move E6, it is in effect a cross between the Slav and the Queen's Gambit declined. Again, the threat of taking on C4 forces white to take a major decision. He cannot very well fall back on the exchange variation anymore, since after C takes D5, E takes D5 is now relatively easy for black. Also, 5 Queen to B3, though not of course a bad move, does not really make life very difficult for black. Both Queen's Gambit declined inspired classical development like Bishop E7, Bishop G5, and then Castle, and a more Slav-oriented approach like D takes C4, Queen takes C4, B5, should wield black a satisfactory position. The latter variation might continue along the lines of 7 Queen D3, Knight on B to D7, E4, B4, Knight to A4, Queen to A5, B3, C5, with equal chances. By far the most popular moves, which have grown into enormously theoretical main lines over the years, are the fifth move E6, the fifth move is E3, generally leading to the Moran variation, and Bishop G5, the anti-Moran Gambit, daring black to take on C4. E3 and the Moran variation. Black now has a large choice of acceptable moves. Knight on B to D7. This is the standard option and also the main path to the Moran. Bishop D3. This is white's most natural move, allowing black to head for the Moran by taking on C4. However, it says much about the respect in which black's following moves are held that practically every legal move in this position has been tried to steer the game in a different direction. Still, even the most widely accepted of those alternatives, Queen to C2, is not particularly dangerous for black. It is true that taking on C4 is then inaccurate, since after D takes C4, Bishop takes C4, white simply has a very useful extra move, Queen to C2, compared to the main line after Bishop D3. But the position after Bishop D6, Bishop D3, or even Bishop E2, for example, black and castle, offers black several possibilities of obtaining a good game. For example, D takes C4, Bishop takes C4, and now either B5 or even E5. Waiting moves too, at least the sensible ones, like Queen to E7, have been shown to be perfectly playable. The only theoretical problem seems to be the wild G7 G4 instead of, for example, 7B D3 or Bishop E2, creating unfathomable complications and steering the game in a totally different direction. D takes C4, Bishop takes C4, B5. This buildup, introduced by Rubenstein in Moran 1924, bears a strong resemblance to the Queen's Gambit accepted and has been extremely popular for at least half a century. Black relinquishes his stronghold on D5 in order to develop his queenside. Within just a few moves, he will be ready to strike back against white's central position with C5. This is a very dynamic and flexible way of playing. 8. Bishop D3. Again, this seems to be the best square for the bishop. 8 B3 and also 8 Bishop E2 have also been played, but without a firm grip on the E4, white will not be able to act quickly in the center. 8 A6. An inconspicuous move, yet this is the starting point for a truly magnificent complex of variations. Black's strategic aim is to attack the pawn on D4 with C5. This will stop white from concentrating all his forces on the king side, where he would otherwise be able to build up a rather threatening initiative, starting with E4. This plan may be executed in several ways. Of these, 8 A6 is only one, albeit the most important one. The first alternative to be considered is 8b4. It looks as if this is not a very good, because after the logical continuation, knight e4, bishop e7, castle, castle, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, e4, white appears to have achieved his strategic goals, while black does not seem to have made a lot of progress. Yet on closer inspection, it is revealed that black has done so badly because he will now simply play bishop b7 and when c5 is unstoppable. Just how crucially important the advance of the c pawn is shown by the fact that if white now plays e5, black will not move his knight to the superficially attractive central square d5, but to d7, where it supports c5. Black has another plausible and sound possibility, for the eighth move is bishop b7. If white then reacts by advancing in the center immediately, for example, e4 from the ninth move, black will apply b4, knight a4, c5, e5, knight d5. This position has turned out to be perfectly playable for black. Tactically, because losing the right to castle after 12, knight takes c5, knight takes c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop b5 check, king to e7 is not a problem. And strategically, because other moves such as castle, c takes d4, always leave white with a somewhat isolated and vulnerable knight on a4, making it difficult for him to utilize his space advantage on the king side. After 8 a6, black is ready to play 9 c5. If white really wants to test this variation, he'll have to respond without delay. 9 e4, c5. We have arrived at the most important starting position of the Moran variation. For almost a century, white has been trying to refute black's opening play outright. At first, 10 e5 seemed the proper way to do this, but it quickly transpired that black has a very strong rejoinder to this advance in c takes d4. This exchange of hostilities creates a veritable jungle of variations that is very hard to see through and is still in the process of being explored. White's best response is knight takes b5. Black now has three major options: knight to g4, a takes b5, and knight takes e5. The last move is based on the spectacular sequence: knight takes e5, a takes b5, bishop takes b4 check, bishop d7, knight takes d7, queen to a5 check, bishop d2, bishop takes b5, leading to an approximate equality. Anyone wishing to play one of these highly dynamic variations should be able to calculate very accurately. A single wrong step can be fatal. Later, it was thought that the more positional 10 d5 refutes black's opening. The first point is that e takes d5 is well met by e5. This advance is much more awkward for black now than a move earlier. Also, keeping the position closed by playing e5, although not bad, tends to favor white in the long run, provided he takes the precaution 11b3 in order to impede further queenside expansion by black. This is why the immediate 10 c4 is considered black's strongest reply to d5. Black can also play queen c3 as a move order subtlety, but he will need to play c4 in most lines quite soon. If white then simply retreats his bishop, queen c2, closing the center by means of e5 becomes much more attractive. The critical test of 10 c4 is thought to be yet another vigorous move. 11 d takes e6. Now f takes e6, bishop c2 leads to a sharp middle game with chances for both sides. Black will be able to develop his pieces very aggressively. For example, queen c5, queen c7, bishop d6, knight c5, while white has options like e5 and knight to g5, with possible attacking chances on the king side. 11 c takes d3, E takes d7 check. Queen takes d7 is also playable, perhaps more solid than f takes e6. Bishop g5 in the anti-Moran Gambit. Not only is this a perfectly natural developing move, it is also a challenge. D takes c4 will now produce the ultra-sharp Botvinnik Variation, a line which has had the greatest of players baffled in the past, which requires tremendous theoretical knowledge from anyone. Of course, black is not forced to play this. He may prefer 5 knight on b to d7, transposing to the Cranebridge Springs variation of the Queen's Gambit declined, or bishop e7, which also avoids great complications. But the most important alternative is 5h6, which is an important variation in its own right. It is known as the Moscow Variation. Now, if the bishop retreats, let's say bishop h4, taking on c4 produces a very different sort of game from the Botvinnik Variation, because after d takes c4, e4, black will be able to throw in g5 first. And then only after bishop g3 will he defend his pawn on c4 by playing b5. For a long time, this was thought to be highly dubious for white at best, but recently this judgment has been queried. White simply continues, bishop e2, and turns out to have a surprising amount of compensation for the missing pawn in his strong pawn center, and potential attacking chances against the black king. And in fact, this is one of the crucial variations of modern day opening theory and can hardly be played without the most thorough preparation. To give just one example, after the deceptively normal continuation, bishop to b7, castle, knight on b to d7, knight to e5, bishop g7, the piece sacrifice, knight takes f7. Interesting move. King takes f7, e5, knight to d5, knight to e4, has caused no end of confusion ever since its introduction in January of 2008. Much more cautious and more traditional is bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. This is a positional variation which poses subtle problems, like what is the best plan for black after e3? E4 is considered rash due to d takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop e4 check. So e3, knight on b to d7, bishop d3, question mark. Perhaps the answer is d takes c4, bishop takes c4, g6, castle kingside, bishop g7, where e4 can be met by e5. All right, d takes c4, the fifth move for black. This variation, named after world champion Mikhail Botvinnik from 1911 to 95, leads to a positionally unbalanced, even chaotic middle game. In very many cases, there's no question of material equality either, making it even harder to judge a position or to decide what is the best move. It really is a variation for specialists and lovers of thorough opening preparation with a good feel for the dynamic aspects of chess. A good memory is also recommended. Theory stretches its tentacles far into the middle game, even to the end game in this line. All right, so e4, b5. Without this, black's previous move would make little sense, but it would be just far too simplistic a view of the Botvinnik variation to assume that black is just thinking of consolidating material gain here. It is all about dynamics. e5. This is what makes the variation attractive to white. Black has only one response, h6. Bishop h4, g5, knight takes g5. White too must be energetic. Bishop g3, bishop d5 would not get him anywhere compared to the above-mentioned Moscow variation, where white has conceded the d5 square. He does have a possible alternative, though, in e takes f6, g takes h4, when knight to e5, queen takes f6, a4 was popular for a while in the 1930s, without ever being able to replace knight to g knight takes g5 though. Okay, so h takes g5, bishop takes g5, knight on b to d7. Now the 10th move, bishop to e7, e takes f6, bishop takes f6, has also been played, but the text move is more aggressive. Black does not want to lose any time over the capture of the white pawn that is soon going to appear on f6. This is the most important starting point of the Botvinnik variation. At first glance, it seems impossible that this position should in any way be desirable for black. But the hidden dynamics because obvious in one, if one imagines black's continuing, black knight on b, bishop to b7, queen to b6, castling queenside, and c5, when all of a sudden his position springs to life. In fact, the pressure against d4, the open lines on the king side, and black's pawn mass on the queen side that may result from this setup have unnerved many an unprepared and unsuspecting opponent in the past. White has to act decisively and fearlessly. It is, for instance, quite necessary after 11 e takes f6, bishop b7, to continue g3, because this both defends the king side against an attack on h2 via the b8 to h2 diagonal, and provides an excellent square on g2 for the bishop. White need not worry about the rejoinder c5, because this allows d5, a bold advance that is usually of crucial importance whenever black plays c5 in this variation. Just how explosive the situation is becomes clear if black now plays 13 b4 question mark, when suddenly bishop takes c4 exclam, b takes c3, d takes e6 would win instantly. A much better idea is to play 13 queen to b6, bishop g2, castle queenside, castle kingside, and only now b4. This leads to a ferocious middle game battle, demanding thorough theoretical preparation from both players. Another variation that illustrates the level of difficulty of the Botvinnik variation starts with 11 g3. If black now simply continues 11 bishop b7, 12 bishop g2, queen to b6, a transposition to the above mentioned line with e takes f6, castle queenside, castle kingside, c5, d5 is likely, but he may also consider 11 rook to g8, provoking h4. When rook takes g5, h takes g5, knight to d5 leads to another totally unclear position. Theory gives g6, f takes g6, queen g4 as the main line here, but will not tell you who is better.